Okay, are you in the Zoom now? It put you as, I promoted you to panelist.
That is fine.
And then let's see.
That is fine.
Hi, Nixon, welcome. Can you hear us, Nixon? Can you test your sound before?
Hi, Cecilia. I'm just about to get to my office, so.
Okay.
Yeah,
No problem.
I'm muted.
No problem. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the last day of our 3-day series. We are so glad that you're still with us. It's been a long journey. And as for the logo, you'll notice today it is facing the right way. So Monday and Tuesday, we did retrospectives. We were presenting to you what has been done, and especially in terms of research, in terms of knowledge, not only with respect to the design of data collection tools, but also the data that has accumulated regarding sensors and chemicals and the problems that have created the climate emergency. And we also explained that that climate emergency in terms of emissions is also a climate, an ecosystem emergency in terms of toxic chemicals. The other part that we have reviewed over the past 2 days is the need for coordinated action. No matter how well we collect the data, data has to be used. And without coordinated activities between humans, not only governments that have the authority to regulate and authorize interventions, but as citizens, as citizen scientists, which means as community members who become aware and collect data, as companies producing manufacturing goods, and as community groups coming together to put forth issues. We know that advocacy tends to be a retroactive. After there's a problem, then one advocates for a solution. However, what we're proposing is to start discussing, co-creating the vision of the future and putting that vision forward in advance, so that then we're not complaining later that the solutions that were built for us did not include us. We should design those solutions in advance and say what we want technically, so that then the outcomes are more aligned with what we expect. And so today, the logo is facing the right way because we're now switching from retrospective to future perspective. We're going to be looking forward on all these issues from the perspective of what it is to build a system in which people are collaborating at different levels. We will then listen to perspectives on finance and where the gaps are in terms of finance. And we will conclude with another practitioner perspective in terms of the architecture and the design and how all that fits together. And stepping in for Professor Wandiga today is our board member, Russo Munene, who will take over and speak on what Professor Wandiga would have spoken. Professor Wandiga sends his apologies. He's chair of council at Jaramogi Odinga University, and he was called for some duties there. And so he's not able to close the session, but Russo Munene, our board member, will open it and close it on his behalf. And with that, thank you very much. And we'll switch chairs so that Russo can take the floor. Thank you. Need to share screen. Sorry, we're having, there we go. Now it showed up on the. Kindly bear with us. and it's easiest to navigate.
I will say good afternoon because it's actually a good evening because it's evening in Kenya. I know there's good morning and good afternoon elsewhere. So as Cecilia has mentioned, my name is Russo. I'm Nene. I sit in the CSTI board, and I'll be covering for Professor Ndiga, who could not, unfortunately, could not make it today. So today I'll be speaking on the transition strategy. So looking at the heavily industrialized countries, because they already have infrastructure in place. So you'll find that they have very complex financial requirements compared to the emerging industrial countries, which gives an opportunity. The lack of that infrastructure then gives an opportunity to build from the ground up. So today, being our last showcase, we will describe ways in which we can work with what we have to develop the outcomes we need by 2050. There is a lot of global academic research and literature on different plant species that are effective for absorbing toxic chemicals, as mentioned yesterday by Professor Wandiga. These approaches, most of the time you find are very costly, very cost-effective because plant species do not require an electrical source to do their work. They use the sun. We already know that plants can absorb chemicals through their roots, leaves, and because we find these traces in the foods that we eat. For the African economies that are largely agrarian, this does not mean that cannot be advanced economies in terms of GDP growth. Our indigenous people have the expert knowledge on an infinite range of diverse plants and their uses. You can think of them as the concept designers and principal investigators who know the direct research teams towards discovery opportunities. So thus we need to pull information from the literature and the community, then bundle this information into small-scale pilots that then assess the viability for industrial scale production. So like any concept designer or principal investigator, our local talents also have to be compensated based on the knowledge that is commercial, is worth for commercial production, rather than based on the local wage rates, which are mostly dysfunctional, are mostly low because of dysfunctional economic systems. This approach is already used with the World IP Organization and others when patents are granted on regional foods and beverages. So for example, a good example is Champagne in France, which then has protection, including appellations of origin. So like for Champagne to be genuine, it has to originate from that area in France that is Champagne. Another example is the feta cheese, which is Greek. So ideally not ideally, but really African communities do deserve the same protections. So on the side of Kenya, we already have indigenous IP laws in place. So for an example, the Kikoi, it's a scarf, an indigenous scarf for the Maasai, but it's ubiquitous in Kenya. That one has been protected, and also tighter baskets because of the process and also the dyes used and the preparation of the dyes. So this way, we will be able to address the triple bottom line, which is the social, really to eliminate poverty, environmental, to identify the nature-based solutions which are more sustainable. And all this now going to the finance side is to align them to the proper metrics and global commercial markets. So then again, when you look at the industrial countries, they're looking to fix, with a net zero approach, they're looking to fix past problems. But with emerging industrial countries, we have the opportunity rather to prevent future problems. So let me give an example of pooling information and bundling projects. Appreciating that data is essential for all activities, whether it is on a residential, commercial, industrial, or even in the natural environment, it is actually quite essential. Going by that, on Monday, we focused on building neighborhoods above ground to reduce the risk of climate-related flooding and the development of microbial sensors that can alert us when water is causing damage to these structures. There's a bit of erosion on the structural integrity. We also talked about commercially ready sensors that can detect harmful chemicals and emissions, as well as we saw how we can use the POSALab platform to improve our ability to work in tandem. So that is emerging industrial countries and the heavy industrial countries, some sort of coordination mechanism. So on pooling information, there are some pertinent questions. So where is the water excess? Where is water in shortage? Where has water been contaminated by the PFAs and the PBDEs? Is the pollution coming from factory effluent, improper waste disposal, or is it from other sources yet to be identified, that need to be identified? Where are the greenhouse gas emission deposits from the air polluting the water? On now bundling of projects, governments have international conventions such as the Water Convention and the Protocol on Water and Health. These global agreements cover both inland and transboundary water bodies. So Lake Victoria has water hyacinth as an issue, and it is a transboundary lake with several of our large inland lakes such as Lake Naivasha, also having water hyacinth. Other places like water systems of Spain, Portugal, and the United States also suffer from the same. It basically grows in dirty water. So here in Kenya, our people by the lakeside have embraced water hyacinth as a food source for livestock, but it is now filled with chemicals, trying to reimagine that waste, that problem into an opportunity. But now again, the opportunity is a bit hazy because of the toxic chemical pollution. So the hyacinth can be used for crafts, but touching the water hyacinth means those toxic chemicals can go into your bloodstream. For advanced industrial countries, or rather advanced industrial countries have had success in using water hyacinth for water filtration. For example, in Disney, they use a very cost-effective system that met all the requisite quality standards. However, when it was noticed that when the population gets too large, then the speed of water filtration requires chemical processing. So it is better than systems where it is only chemical processing this hybrid presents an opportunity. So ideally, we want to reduce the chemicals we are using by preventing the bad chemicals from being used in the first place. Another example, much locally in Kenya, Lake Chala. It's a transboundary lake on the southern side of Kenya, the coastal side, that shares borders with, or rather the lake is on the Kenyan side and Tanzanian side. And as CSTI, we've been building capacity for that community, the Community Forestry Association, and also the beach management unit for the lake. And what is coming on from our side and also from the community, the concurrence that we do not want the problems suffered in Lake Victoria and Lake Naivasha to get to that lake. They have seen and they've appreciated the kind of damage that it brings to the ecosystem. So we also want the Lake Chala community to have meaningful economic activities. So we have laws on how to register a business. We have laws you must follow when you travel from one country to another. However, emissions and pollutants do not have these laws. So the methane and nitrous oxide will fly anywhere without the visa and passport immigration requirements. They can be released in Germany, shortly if they can be detected in Kenya, Brazil, and so on. So for the PFAs that enter, for example, for the PFAs that enter Nairobi River, they will flow to the Indian Ocean. But as they're flowing to the Indian Ocean, obviously they will leave their veins of traces of toxic chemicals, again also on the terrestrial land, and then get to the Indian Ocean. This is why we are all at risk, despite the international treaties and conventions that have been signed. So although we can use sensors to track these chemicals in a specific location, we do not yet have sensors which can be embedded in the chemicals themselves, so that traceability becomes quite easy. We don't know whether the methane gas released in Germany went to Ukraine before coming to Kenya. Like I said, it does not need a visa. So being able to have that level of traceability will actually unravel the root cause. So what we can do is track our building materials and know where they travel, even as waste. If electronic waste plastics with lead, mercury, cadmium, and lithium end up in the water, we know the water will be contaminated. This is where governments can intervene with regulations to make sure we all comply with the mandate not to release waste, including plastic waste, into our water systems. So Kenya has developed an extended producer responsibility regulation for plastic waste, and KEPRO, the governing body, has been vetted with authority to oversee the implementation. This ideally automatically means that full compliance will happen. So looking at pooling information, as citizens, we need to educate ourselves about the science because this will help everyone collect the right data. We need citizens to ask questions about construction materials they are using. The same way, WhatsApp messages are shared wherever there is contaminated sugar. People should also people need to share WhatsApp messages whenever there are contaminated building materials. So yesterday, we were able to see the numerous health risks that exist in addition to the global warming for greenhouse gases. It is only each individual who can report what they are exposed to. So this is really quite interesting because even in the health sector, they appreciate the issues around health really emanate from the environment. And non-state actors over time have been agitating for a one health approach that is environment health, human health, human health, and animal health. So on bundling projects, government can assemble the information gathered into intervention strategies. So for example, illegal sand harvesting for construction projects is killing many youth and is killing the youth and also putting subsurface ground stability of many communities at risk. Houses can collapse even if they are well built. And in 2022, the environmental body in Kenya drafted the sand harvesting regulations to stop this risk from escalating. Some pilot projects in construction also do not have to be expensive projects where you build structures. Pilot projects in construction can also be citizen action on data collection and information sharing in ways that improve the implementation of the regulation. So we really have to stop being spectators and acknowledge that we have a vital role to play in the outcomes for 2015. So let us say a company wants to develop bio-based plastic plates. From concept design to beginning of the manufacturing, the company can ideally spend 5 years and go through a budget of upwards of $25 million. If you go to the company after they have spent this money and say that the plastic product is dangerous, they will still go ahead and sell it anyway. And really because there has been an investment and there's an expected return from the investor. So the investor that gave them the 25 million will be looking at getting the market back. And that's why you find that even substandard products find their way to the market. Although climate finance is available to help companies with this cost of switching technologies, not all companies have the skills or resources to develop effective proposals. The proposals that take time and money, and the proposals rather take time, and also the money will not flow all at once. So, for example, investor may get 5 million in a concessionary loan, then be asked for a $10 million matching fund before they get another 15 million in investment. So that is on a global scale, but also reflecting it locally in commercial finance in the startup space, where we also have SMEs and startups in the green construction industry. It is similar in the sense that you have to show that you don't need the money for you to be funded. So most importantly, although data collection is needed for evidence-based decision making, at present, climate finance does not support research and development activities, only implementation of activities using the existing data. It is important to note that the existing data might be flawed and result in funds being directed towards counterproductive activities, which is a risk that I'm sure we've all experienced. Another example of financial risk, based on assumptions that have no solid evidence. So Africa contributes approximately 4% of global emissions. We need data to forecast which of our green construction activities should be prioritized. Some promote mass timber using imported trees. Advocacy is also about asking questions. Where is the data to show that this is a better use of climate funds than switching to local manufacturing of pozzolana cement using waste aggregates, or, as we saw on Monday, using clay, which is a material most Africans know very well how to use in construction? Where is the data to show if locally grown bamboo would be better than imported trees? Why is it better to ship trees from other countries instead of build local factories to train workers on how to turn bamboo into commercial timber substitute rather? Since we have excess labor due to the high unemployment rates, what about construction techniques such as blended wood? This is indigenous and is already being done by the Orma women instead of machine cut timber. These are some of the questions which need to be asked. So really, these are the current realities of a financial system that does not work well, but we cannot change it overnight. I'm sure Cody later in the webinar, he'll be able to talk about finance. So on pooling information, advocacy is quite critical. However, for advocacy to be effective, it must be strategic. It is not enough to say climate finance is not reaching the ground. This is like going to the store and saying you want bread. So in certain stores, they will surely tell you that they have plenty of bread on the shelf. So go pick what you want. Is it brown bread, white, fresh, prepackaged, variety. And the cost. Similarly, how many people in your community have the financial capacity to use climate finance mechanisms? How many projects need to be financed? How do these projects reduce greenhouse gas emissions? How do these projects reduce the risk of climate-related unemployment? So in a June 2023 Oxfam report, it showed that most climate finance is given in loans rather than grants. However, whether you get a loan or a grant, the return on investment has to be articulated. How is this return going to be measured? On bundling projects, we find that governments can act as guarantors on local projects so that investors are assured of the minimal risk of default. If a government does not back the validity of its own community and innovation, you find that foreign investors, including direct foreign investment, will not trust either the governments, because they are assumed to be in a better position to evaluate the local situation better than them. This also means government officers must be current on the latest technology trends so that they do not erroneously discredit some very good solutions, very innovative solutions. So you imagine in Kenya without M-Pesa today, or M-Pesa being blocked, the ripple effects not only on the economy, but also on the lives of people is enormous. The same is true of climate solutions being developed, just that there are many, and a system of decentralized screening is needed for evaluation and approval. So I say thank you, and if there are any questions, can hand back over to Cecilia.
Experience of community organizing and community resource mobilization. What would you tell community that they should be doing for alignment?
With finance?
Yes.
So as we've already seen and appreciate that finance is quite complex. There are requirements that obviously at the community level, they might not necessarily see the need. Things like having a strategic plan, a 5-year or rather a long-term strategic plan. Things like having the proper registration. So whether if you're in forestry, you align yourself with community forestry. If you're a fisher or have activities in the water, you align with, you register as a beach management unit. I'm sure the other registration in the other countries are similar. And also now on the data, you'll find that most meetings are usually recorded, the minutes are usually recorded for compliance purpose, rather than as a record that can be turned into actionable tasks that can then be followed up. Another area that really becomes a challenge at the community level is now being the mobilization of the community, because it requires an effort to be able to achieve all these things as a community. It requires a time. And you find that most of the people in the community do not necessarily have that time because it is living from hand to mouth. So the bit around mobilizing around a certain issue or a certain association, organization, or task becomes also a bit hard. That is where now being able to get grant finance, then leveraging the grant finance to attract private sector funding when projects are going to scale is there's a big disjoint. Thank you.
So now we're going to switch over. Nixon, I've made you, let me stop sharing. I made you.
Oh, so I can share?
Yes. Try and see. I'll
Yeah,
make you.
yeah.
Okay.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
And is my audio clear as well?
Yes, very.
Okay, so do you want an introduction or should I just go?
You can go ahead, and when you're presenting, introduce yourself, your company, everything.
Thank you so much all for joining in for this last webinar, and thanks for CSTI for giving me the opportunity to share with you some bit of information about how we can build the future that is truly sustainable. Nick Sanatieno, practicing architect and sustainability consultant, the co-founder of sustainability consulting and green technology firm called Nico Green, and also a partner at Trimax Architects. So I'm going to share with us a little bit my insight, but also sharing a little bit of what we are doing towards building the future. So I'll begin by just highlighting the context of the challenge that we are dealing with. I think on the first day, for those who are joined, we had quite an amazing presentation by architect Cedric, who sent us back to the roots to think about the roots, where we came from. And I would give the context then by looking at where we currently are as far as our built environment is. And I would give two scenarios, what we have in our content as Africa continent, looking at how we build basically in Africa. I'll give the case of Kenya, and also I'll look at the case of US. So if you look at the figures on your screen, you can see the way we have been building and both our homes, offices, or infrastructure. So we have a scenario where we take a lot of materials from the earth. We end up creating a lot of pollution. So you can see huge volumes of waste generated from our built environment. So for example, we have 50% of the landfill waste in the US largely being derived from the construction sector. If you look at the Kenyan context, you can see really contradictions. So take, for example, water. We have almost 365 billion rainfall we receive each year, yet we only store about 102 cubic meters out of the 365 billion. So we talk about a water scarce country, yet we have a lot of rainfall that God gives us every year. And this is not captured within our built environment. So we talk about building magnificent structures, but we still have many people who are living in homes that don't have adequate power. We look at the energy use, whether for heating, we can see the gaps there. We look at the sanitation figures. We still have 69% of our population not having access to quality sanitation. Talk about pollution. Every year from the WHO and Ministry of Health data, about 58,000 deaths every year can be attributed to pollution-related diseases that we are exposed to from our built environment. And we could go on and talk about the other social issues. So this is the background of our built environment. Clearly, we need to rethink how we design and build our built environment, our buildings and infrastructure. And that calls on architects, engineers, and practitioners within the built environment to basically also rethink how they are delivering the built environment and infrastructure. So I say that architecture as a profession is undergoing redesign itself to be able to respond to those foregoing challenges that I've just shared. So I present a case that we need to look at the future of building, the future of architectural practice that have been given many names. So some people are familiar with the terms green building. I would more go for sustainable architecture. And I would quote one of the practitioners who have defined sustainable building design as a framework that basically creates a built environment that is rather than harming the environment, is actually contributing to regenerating that environment. So you look at artifacts of either buildings or infrastructure that are net positive producers of energy, food, water, air, and healthy environment for people to thrive while also preserving our ecosystems. I know most of us here are not architects, so I will not really bother to go into the real technical details, but I will just present my philosophical thinking about what that kind of regenerative design could be. I think this has to be underpinned by some key 4WH questions. Why? We need to think, why do we build? What is the guiding philosophy for our design or our construction when we are developing our properties? We need to rethink whether we are purely only being driven by profits or we have a greater purpose that contributes to the regeneration of the communities, regeneration of the systems. And then again, we need to break down our building artifacts, to look at them as basically elements, is an aggregation of different parts. So we need to look at the products, the materials, these components, and how they are tying in together to form that complete whole, which is a building or which is a piece of infrastructure. And then this has to also be situated within a particular context that has a sense of place, which is unique in its physical attributes, cultural attributes, so that we respond to those realities of the context in which we are building. And I think that speaks a lot to what Cedric had mentioned earlier on day one, where we look at our rich heritage, artifacts, and the patterns that we have as Africa, for example. Then we must remember that we are also building, creating the built environment for people and by people. So here we look at, how do we interact from the users? How do we take care of the needs of the users? How do we involve the users in conceptualizing the projects, the buildings that we create? And how do the delivery team, right from the designers, the contractors, and the clients work together in an integrated process to be able to make that building a reality? And then what period are we building for? Are we building projects that will only last 50 years or 20 years or 10? How do we reconcile our short-term interest, for example, of recovering the investments of the capital that we put in the building, with the fact that some of the products, the buildings that we are creating, the infrastructure we're creating, perhaps may last over 100 years or even a century? Do we think about the needs of those people then? So we need to think about the timelines. And then, of course, the process, how we plan this going forward. So when we think of all that, I would frame that future building to be basically comprising of three things. I foresee that future building that would be largely bio-based, so integrating more and more nature solutions in the building, and circular solutions. I will talk a little bit more about the circular approach. My colleagues in the earlier sessions have talked quite a bit on the nature part of it. We need to think about issues of equity and inclusion. How do we integrate? Do we build for the few? Do we only have sustainable built environment for the fewer who can afford, the higher income, middle income segment of the society? Or are we also building sustainable environment and spaces for the masses? Do we need to think about issues of livelihoods, how we create jobs, especially for the young people, and Africa is largely a young continent. So this leads us to think about what kind of platforms we can leverage on, what kind of demonstration projects that we can showcase, what kind of partnerships are we looking at? And then we need to think this with the lens of data. What kind of data do we require? What kind of capacities do we need to build? What kind of policies do we need to actually frame that would be able to guide the delivery of that future that we envision? And so since we are talking about climate change and climate action within the context of the Africa Climate Summit, I would frame this conversation then within the bigger agenda around net zero. And so as as our governments, as different actors are making declaration, even the Nairobi Declaration and ambitions toward net zero, what does this mean in the context of a sustainable built environment, the future that we have just spoken about? I think I would present about 6 key parameters that are of relevance to architects, to the designers and practitioners within the built environment. I would look at our built environment in these 6 parameters. First, of course, we have to think about it within the climate and microclimate we are designing for. Sometimes I find it a little bit unfortunate that as Africans, we are seeing more and more architecture that is suited for temperate climate. We're having more and more glazed building with huge swaths of glazing, which is actually not necessarily fit for our context. As much as we need to bring the nature in, how do we really balance off with, for example, the heat that we receive, the need for heating and cooling the building? Do we take advantage of what our natural context gives us? How do we create buildings that takes advantage of the natural climate, but also safeguards us from the adverse elements of climate? So, for example, you hear building for temperate climate. Why would we design buildings for the arid and semi-arid parts of Kenya, the same as the buildings in highlands parts of Kenya? That definitely is not sustainable architecture, and that is not how we should be looking at the future. We need to move away from the globalization that has given us standardized patterns of how to think about our buildings. Then let's think about materials. Where do we source these materials? What are they made of? Prof. Wandiga mentioned yesterday, talking about chemicals, the issues of toxicity in the materials. That draws us more to begin thinking about, do we need to only accept materials because they've been manufactured and they're well marketed? Do we think about what is contained in them? How do we provide essential services, like powering our buildings, dealing with waste in those buildings? And then who are the users? How do they use the buildings? What times of the day are they using this building? How are their needs and changing over time? So, for example, you're looking at from real estate development perspective, today what was a zone that was popular as an office, largely office development zone, is changing. More and more people are requiring retail. If a building that was designed and built to function as an office block, suddenly the users are thinking of having an entertainment building. Are our buildings suitable for such changing dweller needs? So these are some issues that are parameters that our architects, designers have to deal with. Now, if I talk now from emissions perspective, carbon emissions perspective, there is the idea and need to reduce the carbon footprint of our building. Have buildings that have less carbon footprint so that we are able to meet that carbon reduction targets that we are committing to, even in the processes, policy processes that we are having, for example, the declarations just we had. Now, what does this mean to a practitioner? So I will give this roadmap looking at about 6 stages of a project and some key issues that need to be considered. Now, the design teams and the clients from the onset have to think about translating those global goals, the national goals, the commitments that have been made to their project scale. So they need to think about, for our project, what are the realistic targets of carbon reductions we can set? What are the timelines we are looking at? What are the opportunities that we can harness to actually achieve those targets? And then, having set those targets, what elements, remember I talked about parts. So what materials, what products will help us achieve that? And then here comes the growing need for more and more designers to understand issues of carbon of the projects across the entire building life, right from project conceptualization to the use of the building, to the point that the building has to be dismantled, or in our familiar term, has to be demolished or converted into some other use. So are our architects, are our clients, are our engineers aware of the need to do whole life carbon assessment? Do they have the necessary expertise to do that? And if they don't, how do we build their capacity? Then there comes the issue of transparency. So if we talked about our targets, are they verifiable? If we need materials, do they have third-party verifying declaration certificates? So we have tools that are in the marketplace called environmental product declarations, or more aspirational health product declarations that give a testament of the environmental attributes of those materials. The truth for Africa is that currently we don't have any single native African manufacturer that has produced an environmental product declaration certificate. And we know, number one is the issues of the capacity gap. Number two is the cost of producing this. The cheapest environmental products declaration certificates you can find currently would cost you around 3 million Kenya shillings. That is in the tune of 30,000 US dollars. Many manufacturers cannot afford this. So how do we make transparency systems that are affordable for us, that work for us, that also take into consideration the real factors of our production within our local context? And then, of course, we need to think about our approval processes. What kind of data are we talking about? It is very interesting that many countries in Africa, including Kenya, currently don't have any robust national greenhouse gas inventories. So how do we, as we set targets for our individual projects as practitioners, how can we set those when we don't have even national targets? And so how do we as an industry accelerate the productions of robust data? For example, for the global warming potential, the greenhouse gas inventories for Kenya. How do we shift from our normal submission processes within the county, within the physical planning, to take advantage of the national determined contribution, the greenhouse gas inventories? And lastly, once we have built and have our projects ready, do we have provisions to educate our users in terms of what are the environmental, what are the sustainable design attributes? What are the climate attributes of those buildings? How do our users ensure that they operate those buildings in a way that ensure that they perform as intended? Do our architects, engineers go back to those buildings and assess whether the assumptions they made are actually working in practice? So there is more and more need of undertaking post-occupancy evaluations. But who would pay for this? Are they affordable? Do we know? So those are some of the issues that our designers need to deal with in this future we are looking at. So I would summarize the challenges and some of these questions in terms of 4 areas. There is need for data to inform the design. So how do we strengthen that? We need to relook at how we frame our contracts. Contracts between clients and consultants, contracts between consultants and contractors, contracts between developers, and many contracts, manufacturing, construction contracts, consultancy contracts, to ensure that we capture all of those issues, the parameters that have to be dealt with. We cannot continue to cooperate the way we were in terms of how we structure the delivery of our projects and yet expect that we can be able to truly deliver sustainable building projects. Then we have to talk about cost. I know Russo will be talked a bit about finance, and Cody will be talking more about financing the projects. We need to think more clearly. The additional costs that are required need to be met. Who would pay for them, when and how? And how are those costs distributed within the contracts for the projects that we are having? And then the issue of capacity building. How do we reskill ourselves? How do we retrain ourselves? How do we move from awareness to actually having the key competencies to be able to deliver the truly sustainable buildings and infrastructure for the future? So those are some issues that we have to deal with. So allow me just in the next few minutes to focus a little bit in one aspect of that truly sustainable built environment for the future, which is circular. Circularity basically looks at closing the loops in our material supply. Thinking from, the entire life cycle of building, from the design, coming from linear pathway where we take materials, extract them, manufacture them, bring them in our projects, use them, and then we throw them away, to basically ensuring that we take, manufacture, use, and reuse again. There are many theoretical frameworks defining that term we call circularity. And you have almost 8 things, whether you talk of refurbishing, repairing, recycling, reuse, repurposing. There would be many aspects of that, but I would not focus on that. I will only look at some of the models that are already evolving within the built environment. So we are looking at people trying to unlock circular supply chains, how you access the materials, the take-back mechanisms being designed. We have businesses, opportunities that are evolving around recovery and recycling of materials. There are people that are looking at extending the life cycle of the products, so that rather than designing, for example, lighting fixtures that only have to last within 5 years, then you have to replace them, you design them to be robust, that they live for 20 years. But then comes the question, if you have designed your lighting fixture to last for 20 years, how do you ensure as a lighting manufacturer, you are still in business and earning revenue 20 years down the line? So there comes changes in terms of the business model. And I would point to an example, for example, of a project that an architect designed with Philips, that rather than selling the lighting fittings, you buy the lighting fittings for X dollars, you sell the lighting as a service. So you access the service, you buy certain lighting hours. And once the lighting fixture is broken, it is the responsibility of Philips to come and fix their lighting fitting and install another one. So that incentive gives the incentives to Philips to produce a more durable lighting fixture, which will ensure that it's giving lighting for their customers for a longer period while they're making money, but then also the owner doesn't have to bother with keeping the products or figuring out how to fix them. How do we create more sharing economy where we can, rather than owning, we rather more are sharing? So what is not useful for me may be useful to the other party. How do we enable that? So for example, we have offcuts in the construction site. There are pieces of wood that we may not use in our construction project. How do we create mechanisms that somebody else could use them in their other construction project? How do they know about that? How do they access it? What kind of logistics we need to work on? And I've mentioned products as a service. So then enabling factors that would encourage those models here, there would be issues to deal with the tools that we need. These tools, for example, within the design phase would include aspects or principles we call designing for deconstruction or designing for disassembly and reassembly, and designing for flexibility. So just to demystify that, we would look for example, how we assemble the elements, the parts of our building. I would just give a case using a window, for example. We could have a metallic window, a steel window. That steel window could be installed onto the wall. It could be welded. It could be riveted. If you choose, for example, welding, if I want to replace that window, it means I have to cut it down, and then I'm not able to recover that material in a way that I can just go install it somewhere else. But if I riveted that same assembly, it is easier for me to just unbolt it. If I bolted it, for example, I'll just unbolt or unscrew, and then I can carry it, dismantle it, go install it somewhere. So architects now, designers need to begin thinking about how we are assembling our building elements in a way that 50 years down the line, it is 100 lifespan project. But I may begin thinking probably after 15 years, this partition, I don't need a 3x3 room because I want to make it an educational hall. So I need to expand the room to be 12 by 12 meters. So what happens to that partition at build? I just need then to dismantle that partition and move it. So I need to design in a way that it allows disassembly. Then in terms of information, what do we need? I talked already about life cycle data. We need to think about ownership structures. So I give a case, for example, you have a developer who wants to build and sell the building within 3 years, they have already exited the project. So if they made investment, for example, they invested in some technologies, they invested in some elements of the building. How do you ensure that such an investor who wants to exit within 3 years is still able to accrue returns on the investments that they have made? How do we ensure that the users are aware as the ownership of the buildings, of element of the building are changing? If you are talking about warranties, we are bringing in reuse or recycled materials. How do we assure that they will perform technically? We are not bringing in toxic elements back into the building as much as we are promoting reuse. How do we trace the owners? How do we trace the materials right from the manufacturers to the users as they change hands? So what is happening, emerging within the practice, we are coming up with principles and concepts like looking at as buildings as material banks and developing material passports. Just think of the way you have your passport. If I'm traveling to Kenya, anywhere I go, you will know my attributes. I come from this location, I'm this old, this is my age, this is my height. So we need to begin thinking of building materials that are going into our projects, having their own embedded passports, so that if that element moves from one project to the next, at any point I can be able to clearly know this material had these attributes, and I can check that, validate, and confirm, and before I use it in the next project. So how do we make those tools like material passports mainstream part of construction? And then how do we enhance collaboration? How do we activate issues of transparency? How do we enable sharing more to be mainstream? So moving from just idea of what could happen, I will just give an example within our Kenyan context, what we are trying to do as a practice. We are trying to reduce waste by first ensuring that we estimate accurately. And this is not a problem for many who are, are able to access the services of architects, are able to access the services of quantity surveyors, because then they will prepare bills of quantities, schedule of materials, and then they can do the accurate estimation. But as again I said, the future of building must be inclusive and equitable. Majority of people who are building their homes, they build by themselves. They work with, craftsmen, artisans that do not have those skills. And some of those artisans, they're not able to do accurate estimation. So what happens? They end up overestimating. So what we have provided then as a solution is to create a digital open source estimating tool, which such do-it-yourself builders and artisans, tradesmen within the industry can use to calculate accurate material requirements, so that they don't overestimate, they don't overorder, and then have materials that are ending up as waste. And then, even though we estimate accurately, it is still inevitable that we would still have waste. I would give you an example. For example, every BQ, bills of quantities or schedule of materials that a quantity survey prepares, has a provision for about 10% of wastage. And that is an allowance that is given where probably materials will be broken down in handling or in transport. So what happens to those 10%? So you need 10% of those materials that are wasted, in quotes, within the construction project. Can we have more platforms for people to be able to exchange and use them? So to allow that, we have developed a digital reuse market where those who have excess surplus materials could link up with those who need them, so that we divert those materials from the landfill. And one way of that, of course, is through trading into those materials. So you can buy from one project, somebody can buy for their projects, but then there are other people who may not necessarily need to sell. So they may need to provide these materials to social projects that meet community needs. So that then we handle that by providing a non-profit, a sharing platform that people can donate those materials to other projects. And then lastly, we are looking at how do we train the workforce at an accelerated scale so that we equip them with the skills that they can be able to handle those circular projects. So we have developed a program to recruit young people within colleges and also those who are in the community, to train them and empower them to be able to build the project. So we're calling this in the level design challenge. And that combines both online remote mentorship and training platform with hands-on lessons through the social demonstration projects that we are implementing. And I give you just one case, for example. On day one, we spoke about concrete and cement. We know it is one of the big footprints of carbon emissions in the construction sector. But people talk about the cement itself, but we don't. Let's think about the packaging of that cement, for example, just to give you an opportunity, an example of an opportunity. So Kenya, for example, in 2021, we consumed about 6 million tons of cement. If you work out this in terms of the packaging material, each year we have 124 million bags of cement, which are made largely from plastic. So these ones end up being released into the environment. In most cases, we have them being burnt down and releasing toxic emissions into the environment, or we find them just thrown away. So they end up in our drainage channels, clogging our drainage system. So when it rains in the city, we are flooding, and that becomes another major climate risk. Or they end up into the oceans. And we know, of course, even issues with plastic pollution in the oceans, they end up into being eaten by fish, and some of us eating them. So if we were to divert, for example, those 124 million bags from our construction projects in Kenya and use them as holding bags for walls, for example, fencing, we have, from our calculation, we find that we could be able to fence 2,000 schools with those cement bags in a year and divert 3 million cubic tons of debris. Thinking of the debris here could be excavation waste, or it could be, other debris from the construction site, which in most cases end up in the landfill. We could be able to divert that and have them onto walls of school. In one way, reducing the carbon emissions, and another way, providing safe environment for learners in the schools to stay with, harnessing all those issues of equity that I spoke about. So that is just a simple case of what we are trying to do, how we can harness those bags, bring them into earth bag. If you were to do that for many other elements of the, hundreds of materials that are used in the construction sector, you realize that the problems that we have could be solved by thinking about building not only as a whole structure, but as components of parts. And to be able to do that at scale requires partnership. It requires people working together and changing their thinking. Here I give another example of one project, an element of what you're doing. So here you're looking at using, for example, we have at the summit, people have banners. We have during elections, or we have events, we have a lot of membrane materials that we create, then we throw them away, including the climate activists, the money. So you could get those ones, for example, and use them as roofing materials. Then you have broken tires, the offcuts that are coming from this school. So this is a particular project that we have developed for a girls' school, which does not, a 1,200 girls boarding school that does not have a dining hall. They don't have a library. So this project, we are looking at how we can harness some of those broken materials, create, for example, this is a dining table, which under it, we have storage cabinets that ask us their books they're storing, or they could store their plates. We have the canvas there. These are well designed in a way that you can just disassemble them. We harness that water, bring it down. You are creating some of your nature-based solution. Even at that small scale, you have planters that then purify for them air, so that these learners can have at least a conducive space to read and eat, while we are demonstrating also the possibility of using reclaimed materials. Such kinds of small-scale thinking could be moved at scale, but then they require systemic thinking and all of us working together, looking at the opportunities that we have. So with those few remarks, I just invite us to keep the thinking that the future for us is to be a sustainable built environment. It requires our collective action, and wherever we are, whatever role we play, we are able to contribute to building that future. And I invite you to join us in building that future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nixon. That was absolutely wonderful, and gives real-time examples of what we can do now. During the Monday presentation, we had a lot of people saying, this is fabulous, but how long will it take? Even though architect Cedric's explained that it could be built now, I think what you're showing is even more reaffirmation that what we need is more of a change in mindset. There's a lot that we can do with the materials that we have now and the tools that we have now. And it's a matter of redirecting. Let me check for questions. I'll ask one question and then, well, two questions. Number one, do you have time to stay at the end of Cody's presentation in case there are additional questions? Do you have time on your end? Okay, good. And then the second question is, so let's come at this from the government perspective and thinking about we have 47 counties in Kenya, and we want to give them guidance on what they should start doing in order to make these ideas that we're talking about implementable. What would you recommend as a first step?
Yeah, very interesting question. Yeah, you're putting me on the spot. I think for me, the first level is moving from speaking to ourselves to doing an outreach to them. And that outreach has to involve packaging the information in terms of sensitizing them at the point that makes a case for them. And that would first target the county government leaders. The county government leaders are politicians. So we have to frame our conversation from scientific or practitioners' perspective to speak in their language. So what is their language? Their language, most of them are thinking of how they are going to be re-elected. And so we have to think about how does this help their electorate, them look good before their electorate by doing good. And so I wouldn't give the practical lens on what that means. I think we have to frame them. I think as a practitioners, and what CSTI I know is already doing together collaboratively with Nico Brain is reaching out to counties. So far, we have already 10 counties that we're already conversing with and looking at how we can go to have pilots at communities where they can see, feel, they can know the cost, they can know the impact, and then look at what kind of the investments would be needed if that is to be moved at scale, but also ask themselves, what are the policies they can put in place to make that possible at scale? So I think it has to be applied more case by case, but moving from talking to ourselves to talking to them in their language. Thank you.
And in terms of information solutions, because we're also promoting information solutions as a no cost. I know in the US, not only we have at the county level, municipal level, building codes are made available and zoning guidelines and all that, those documents. But there's also a feedback process. So it's not just that you're reading those documents, there's a process to be able to submit recommendations on improvement. Our building code is, of course, going through approval in terms of how to get that. And there are issues about a lot of delay in terms of submitting updates. Would you think that a central repository or online citizen repositories where they're submitting feedback on a regular basis would be helpful?
Absolutely. But though the challenge from my little experience, we have tried with the Kenya Lands of Residents Association implementing a pilot for Nairobi County, is how to move to convince those who are involved in planning and the receiver to see that you are not basically when people have that room for feedback, they will be overwhelmed with response and they can also be painted in negative picture. So I think those are some of the concerns that we are facing, but it is very much important what you're saying. It should be the way forward. But we have to think about what the policymakers, those people see as barriers. And if we are able to respond to those barriers in a way that makes them see it helps them, rather than put them on the spot, they would be able to receive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nixon. We will switch to Cody because he's taking some time off of work and he's in the UK and the day has not finished. So, and then we'll get back to you. Thank you, Cody. You can go ahead and share.
Good afternoon, evening, everyone. So thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you at this auspicious event. My name is Cody Mullman. I've got a background in finance and accounting. I'm the executive advisor to CSTI and also Taturanu, which is a sustainable rainwater harvesting social enterprise based in southern Madagascar. And so I'll be talking about climate finance and the costings of environmental monitoring technologies. So let me just share my screen. Let me know if you can see, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, yeah, so climate finance and the cost of environmental monitoring technologies. So in the first instance, just wanted to give a brief overview of what a few topics I'll be touching on, just a bit of background on climate finance in an African context, talking through some of the challenges that climate finance faces in an African context as well, but also sort of more broadly than that. Then go into a bit of an introduction into environmental monitoring technologies and technology innovation, the barriers to implementation of such technologies, then some suggestions on the way forward, and then some top tips that I've sort of picked up from my experience and from sort of listening on other people's experiences from around the globe. So just, I'm sure we're quite familiar with this concept, but just as sort of a refresh, so what is climate finance? It refers to local, national, or transnational financing drawn from public and private sources of financing to support the mitigation and adaptation of actions that will address climate change. Climate finance is used to incentivize investments and development of renewable energy infrastructure, sustainable agriculture, or other adaptations. And whilst I let that sink in, it's worth thinking about how you would think about this incentivization should happen. How should it happen? How are we able to incentivize the different players that have just been referenced and mentioned above to participate and act in concert to achieve the stated aims? And off the back of that, how are investment decisions being made, right? So you've got a whole lot of incentives being aimed and targeted at various players along sort of the value chain. But then behind the scenes, you've always got the investors and the financial institutions. So on what basis are they to make the investment decisions, right? Because things are changing. The standard way of evaluating the risk and returns of investment is not necessarily the same. The risk profiles are not as well understood. So these are some of the challenges which are constantly being brought up. And I think as we talk about all sorts of climate solutions, we should think about how to communicate and speak to the different people that are making the investments themselves and how they're able to incorporate the information into their decision-making processes. So key challenges that are being faced with climate finance, sort of lack of coordination, just generally across the board in terms of between climate funds, multinational development banks, and bilateral assistance providers. There seems to be a general lack of leadership as well, or a strong leadership, shall I say that, in sort of driving the decision making in a particular direction. And as such, you sort of have some efforts at moving things forward, but never quite in concert or acting in the significance that's required in order to achieve sort of the climate co-benefits, right, and to maximize sustainable development. Sort of inadequate reporting and transparency. There's lack of sufficient data, KPIs, and reporting matrix. And so there's not timely and accurate data to enable efficient decision making. And sometimes then the policy making is then lagging off the back of that. There's a lack of private sector involvement. I think a lot of the key focus of this summit has been to try and mobilize private sector involvement and funding and participation in sort of addressing some of the climate challenges, but I think we still have a long way to go on that. And again, reflecting back on what I said in the previous slide, it's thinking about how to engage the private sector on these topics and what sort of incentives can the government, the treasury, the public sector offer to sort of entice the private sector into helping. And then there's the high cost of finance, right? So currently climate and / green related investments are currently perceived as high risk, and with sort of a longer term view to realizing the returns. And given that the returns are not sufficiently adequate to compensate for the perceived risk upfront. Now, whether that's actually a perceived risk or an actual risk is still under, I suppose, up for debate. And there just is some uncertainty which has not quite been addressed as to how this bridge or this difference between the financing is going to be addressed, right? So financial incentives aimed at simply lowering the cost of finance by themselves would be insufficient. There would have to be a sort of a more end-to-end view of the finance value chain in order to sort of achieve the cost efficiencies that we're hoping to achieve and lower the cost of finance for the different players to participate. So switching, that's a bit of a background, right? And switching tack then to the sort of more focused areas of environmental monitoring technologies and innovation. So just a bit of an introduction there as well. Environmental monitoring describes the processes and activities needs to characterize and monitor the quality of the environment. And that could be anything, right? From remote sensor networks to observations, telemetry systems, Internet of Things. With the data that's gathered from these sensors, you could then apply things like machine learning or artificial intelligence to sort of infer things about the data and sort of make the decisions around that. And all of these together comprise then the environmental monitoring technologies that I was referring to, right? So that's just to give you a bit of a flavor as to what they are and why there are such significant barriers to implementation, given that the technology is quite costly. The biggest and largest barrier of entry for real-time monitoring is the upfront cost, right? And often this is prohibitively expensive and kind of prevents the commencement of any sort of investment in this area, right? And secondly, then the ongoing monitoring and maintenance costs also need to be considered, right? Because those are also not negligible. And oftentimes after a certain number of years, you might need a whole sort of refresh of the whole system, as in you might need to re-incur the significant costs that you had up front. More local problems then. So there's a limited or lack of local knowledge and skills for the development and implementation of such solutions. And the technology stack itself is fairly limited, as in not all the technologies operate, say in a country like Kenya, or even more broadly on the African continent. The technologies might only be available in more developed countries. And so all of these things sort of hold back the potential and the implementation of such solutions. So I guess standing back then, thinking a bit about, so how can these be overcome and how can the business case be made to work, right? So I think I've got an example which I'll sort of get to at the end, where Naturesphere, which is the social enterprise that was referenced in Madagascar, has installed rainwater harvesting systems all over the south of Madagascar and required these to be monitored, right? And so a good example of the monitoring then was just upskilling the local community to just send in data as to how the rainwater systems were performing. And off the back of that, then we would have the data as to the water quality, how much rain was received, what the dispensing capacity and what the current potential was of the different systems. And as such, I think that kind of model would work in a wider sense in the first instance, right, until such technologies can be implemented, right? So what I'm proposing here is kind of like a manual approach first, and then maybe thinking about how to then, in a phased fashion, implement the technology around that. I'll switch to the demo sort of at the end, but let me just, sorry, I'll switch to the demo now actually. Okay, just to give you, while we're talking about it, let me know if you can see my screen, right? Okay, so this is an example of the monitoring system that Naturesphere has, right? So we're looking at the south of Madagascar, and each one of the little icons here represents a system that's either is inactive or is currently inactive or waiting repair, etc. Right? So this was first used to just basically track the repair status, but then it has since expanded to include sort of statistics about the amount of water dispensed, etc. Right? So if I sort of click on one of these items, it will tell you, okay, this is the name of the water system, whether it's dispensing water or not, what type of system it is, how many weekly users it has, and the capacity, etc. Right? And how this data gets back is just simply the local community having Tataronu cell phones, right? And then when they're able to get back within cell phone range, they can upload data according to a set template to sort of gather and send in sets of these photos as to what that looks like in the area that was under construction, and then what the status is, right? And you can look then at the detailed data. So this is the detail about the particular site. And then we have what's called a Tataronu agent on site who's responsible then for that particular system. So applying that to our concept of environmental monitoring, you could have agents or community-enabled, or the community-enabled individuals who are able to monitor and track the particular aspect of the environment, right? So it could be anything that they're looking at, right? As long as they're given the skills to be able to like look at and analyze the output and the quality, say, of the measure being looked at. In this case, it's water and water quality. Let me switch back to my slideshow. Okay. So the way forward then, this is just a sort of a high-level roadmap of how you might get from where we are today to an actual implemented system for monitoring and evaluating sort of the environment, right? And key on the slide, I guess, is that where we are currently is in the research and development / discovery phase, right? Still a lot of work to be done around feasibility studies, research activities, gaps and needs analysis, etc., defining the targets and the pathways, but then ultimately you would want to start building out a business case, right, to make this all work. And the business case would be developed from the roadmap, right? And that's based on the prioritized needs analysis, right? Once you've done that, then you can move into the design and build phase, then into implementation, and then ongoing continuous monitoring, right? So the pilot essentially would be the opportunity to demonstrate the value that such a project would have, right? And I mean, some of the feedback that we had is that these projects are often too large. So often, let's think about chunking it up into something smaller where we can demonstrate a proven concept early on, so that you can get stakeholder buy-in and then continue with the implementation plan. And just at the top, I had a key question there around what assets do you think you already have, or what do we have to leverage already, right? We've already got lots of thinking. There's lots of thinking going on around. There's lots of ideas and solutions which could be pulled together at this stage to start pulling together a roadmap and a logical way forward, right? And across the top, we've got sort of an indicative timeline, but it's just about putting this all sort of on paper and making sure that it sort of flows in a continuous logical sort of program from left to right, and then onwards from years 2, 3 to X going forward, right? And then continuously refining that and following an agile approach. Finally, then, just to recap, then, sort of top tips as a finance individual. I'm often, I think, out on a limb when there's lots of scientists involved and lots of engineers talking with their particular views, and then I always think about, well, what would I want to see? And given that the challenges are finance related, I think these sort of 6 things would be sort of my takeaways I leave with you, right? So the first one is identify the use cases and the opportunities that would be prime candidates for implementation of these environmental monitoring technologies, right? And the same thing could apply for any sort of application of technology. So which ones would be like low-hanging fruit? Which ones would unlock efficiencies faster than some of the others, right? And then you can have a prioritization of the use cases based on a scoring matrix, right? So which is the potential to release the most benefits, and whether they be financial or other benefits, versus the cost of implementation, right? So the ones that have high benefit potential, sort of a short timeline and a low cost, would be the ones that would be prioritized first, right? To demonstrate the value that's being brought. Third one, then, to set the overall vision so people know the direction of travel, right? So the multi-year vision, but then start smaller first. Prove the concept with a pilot. And that doesn't mean that once the pilot's over, people check out and leave and don't hand over any of the skills. Make sure that there's handover and that there's some sort of skin in the game for the people that are involved in the pilot and the ongoing roadmap. Fourth one, then develop the business case and the roadmap, right? The costs and benefits. So off the prioritized use case, like listing that you've just developed, think about what the business case is, right? So what are the benefits that are going to be generated? When are they going to be generated, sorry, and build that into an actual business case that can be submitted to someone who speaks the finance language. And then, yeah, so key number 5, speak the right language to appeal to finance audiences, right? So devil's in the detail. So like less theory, more like actual process, like how is it actually going to happen? How is it going to be implemented? What's the risk associated with this? What are the returns? When can we expect the returns? Those are the type of things that would start appealing to finance audiences. And 6th, then finally get stakeholder buy-in, ensure alignment, right? Because there's lots of players that are involved in sort of all these projects and programs, and just to make sure that everyone's got sort of the right motivations behind why they're doing things, and also make sure that they're sort of all traveling in sort of the right direction. That's it from me, and sort of left with a quote. Actually, Cecilia added it in, but I said it to Cecilia before. It does not do to leave a live dragon, or in an African context, a rhino, out of your calculations if you live near one. And that's by J.R.R. Tolkien. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Cody. And yes, it's you shared a nice set of project management quotes, and that's a favorite one. And the reason for that being a favorite one is this issue of baseline data, making the business case. Scientists tend to define some of what is called in finance assumptions. They tend to define those as parameters, and then use the language assumptions when they're actually doing the model of, for example, can we assume that this would be the steady state in 5 years, or things like that. When they go into the parameters, from a scientific perspective, a research justification does not look very different from a business case justification. And I'll give you an example. If one were to say, based on data from the UK, for example, Nixon was saying these number of bags of cement, the polythene bags, would contribute X amount of CO2 emissions. And then you take the UK parameters and put that into your model and say, okay, we need to verify, but we would estimate that it would be this amount of CO2 emissions in Kenya. What has been happening in the local scene is when finance is applying, financial people are applying to get revenues to come in, they use assumptions. When people who are doing projects submit assumptions, they tell them you're not valid because you don't have local data. So there's a lot of frustration about why is there seemingly a double standard on what counts as valid data. I don't know if you could speak to that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's a valid point. I think over time it's probably just about educating, right, the different audiences as to like what we mean by assumptions in each case, right? And maybe if it's explicitly clear which are like financial assumptions and versus what are like assumptions in kind of in more the scientific sense, maybe there are a different category of assumptions when you submit, then people will know, right? Because like a financial assumption that would just be accepted is after 5 years, we'll assume that everything grows at inflation rate, basically, right, going forward, and no one's going to challenge that, right? But everyone knows that that's not like when it gets to 5 years time, that's not going to happen, right? So like it'll be something else, right? And I think I also mentioned to you, no one's ever in year 2 of their 5-year plan, right? They're always in year 1 rebase of their 5-year plan, right? So it's kind of like meeting halfway and just trying to, I mean, you kind of know the direction of travel, and as I say, articulate the vision, but then try and refine in like the short, like as you can tweak and refine the assumptions as you go along, right? With some of the others set as something to validate later, then I think that's kind of the way to go. Yeah, maybe just categorizing them and educating as to what the difference is.
And then I know another question that comes up, you mentioned Statriano and how they start modeling on paper first. for lack of a better definition, and then switching to digital. There are those who believe design the system in digital so that you're designing in the system that it will be intended to be used. Do you have any insight on what made Tatiana decide to start with paper before going digital?
So the rural southeast of Madagascar, which is where Tatirano operates, is a very isolated part of the country, right? It's almost, the roads are almost impossible. So it was unrealistic to get any sort of technology into some of those regions, right? They are like 8 hours drive on some of the worst roads we've ever seen in Africa. I mean, maybe there's somewhere else I haven't seen, but to get from Port Jefan to Farafangana, which we saw on the map there, is at least 8 hours drive on a terrible road. So in order to quickly have a monitoring system or evaluating system in place, we had to just upskill the community, right? And we had to send members of the community out into the mountains, right? Because the rainwater system is the advanced technology anyway, right? And that's still been implemented, right? But it's more the monitoring, right? And some people would disappear into the mountains for days, but then with no cell phone reception, but come back with reports on their cell phone with pictures of what the system was performing like, right? And that's just the reality of the situation, right? Some of the ones, the systems that are closer to the larger towns, then have the digital sensors, et cetera, right? And those would be expanded out as more resources come in and it becomes practical to do so, right? So it was just a case of practicality and need driving that first. But it would still be designed with it's still a simple system, right? It's still like you could design a whole lot of rules which could ultimately become embedded within the rules of a technology engine, right? Like, yes, no, what is, these kind of things. So with that in mind, you could design something that could be future-proof.
And you also mentioned incentives. And here in Kenya, there's a program, a system called Water Resource Users Association, which is similar to what we saw you demonstrate. Basically, you have a nodal in the community and there are people designated for monitoring consumption. This is more on freshwater systems, but I'm sure if there were a containerized system, that would also apply. And they've been trained. Challenges the Users Association report is one, lack of consistency. Those who are assigned to collect the data, and life happens, you get sick, your children get sick, you forget to collect the data or report that day. Other is that as they're working with these systems, they realize there's a maintenance cost to all this reporting and data collection, and there was no financial provision for that. Can you speak to recommendations on how they should address those types of challenges?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's exactly what some of the challenges that Tatirano had. So Tatirano is structured as a social enterprise and not an NGO on purpose, right? So that it can also generate its own profits in a corporate arm through the sale of treated water sales in town. And the idea was that those profits, and any excess profit that Tatirano generated from the sale of commercial water that in town would then be reinvested into its other activities that were loss-making. So it's about subsidizing within the organization itself the loss-making activities, which were then the maintenance costs and the ongoing training costs, right? So that was, and we're still getting there, right? It doesn't quite work out, but we've kind of structured the pillars of Tatirano in that we've got new systems installations as the one pillar, which is kind of the NGO part because we get funding in from funders. The second part is monitoring and evaluation, right? Which is any excess is then moved over into that funding, and then currently it's currently being costed as a program in itself, because the standard NGO model is to kind of implement something and then kind of leave again, but that's not what we're doing here. And in Madagascar, the law is that the community owns the water system, right? So it's kind of the community feels like they own it and are responsible for it. So there's a lot of community liaising going on, so that they feel like they're also benefiting from it. And if they're able to then have larger containers, they're able to sell the water within their own communes as well. And so all of that we found has worked really well, because about accountability, the community feeling like they own it, the community understands it, the chief of the village, Chef Kontani, understands, and appreciates the potential of the clean water, right? Because again, it's also about the education as to like the benefits, etc., right? And yeah, and then around the training, we've got accountable individuals by region who then travel around and upskill based on and do like assessments with the person on like in person, and they ask them to do the assessment, and then they assess whether they do know what they're doing or not. Otherwise, they need to go from training and maybe watch some videos or be shown how to do it.
Thank you for that. And just to give, sometimes people have a challenge with geography. So if you're trying to think, what do I know about Madagascar? Think about baobab trees. A land famous for
yeah, and lemurs. And lemurs.
Yes, and lemurs and baobab trees.
Yeah.
And now you'll understand that the sensitivity of the context, because it's also highly arid, and of course,
well, it's actually it's actually got a very complicated and quite complex rainfall, I suppose, distribution relief map. Is on the east coast, there are quite high mountains, and then there's constant easterly winds blowing in. More than 1,000 millimeters of rain falls there, but then immediately on the western side of the watershed is the really arid side. So the water solutions are specific to the type of climate in Madagascar. So actually, the ones we were talking about are rainwater harvesting systems in high rainfall areas where the problem was contamination rather than lack of rainfall. So it's about cleansing the water by putting the rainwater system on the roof, then a flush system, and then decontaminate the water. But to the west, it's about water trucking and water storage to survive long periods between rainfall, right? So adaptive rainfall technology, right? Yeah.
And that's really important. Nixon had been talking about climate specific solutions, not just locally based solutions, but climate region specific solutions. And this starts to show we have the same challenges in the northern part of Kenya. It tends to be more arid. There is rainfall, they get flooding, but they also get extended periods of very little. Some places have had water shortage for about 3 years, which of course has a negative impact when you have an unmanaged consumption of that water. So, yeah. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And now we'll switch back to you, Nixon. You have a question here in the chat from Jared. How can I, as a layman, participate with the implementation of the solutions that you suggested? Especially the architectural solutions for in local communities.
Thanks. I just typed my response, but I'll speak to it a bit. Thanks, Jared. I think that's a very good question. I often see any layman is whether they're engineers or not, or architects, they shape the built environment, either as a user or also as owners, because you live somewhere, you work somewhere. That is a built environment. And so I think the beginning point would be to ask yourself, what is within your power to do? Whether you're engaging with what in Kenya we call fundis, those who are the craftsmen who are building, or you could be able to guide them and demand. So first, of course, inform yourself now from like the knowledge we are sharing, that we don't have to build necessarily do informing them. Two, so for example, if you are a user, if you're even a tenant, do you have to let all your lights going on? How do you choose which fittings you're fitting in there? You have some power that you can leverage and make a difference. Now, if you want to build by yourself, the tools, as I mentioned on the chart, those tools that we have created, they are created purely for the layman. So like the estimating tool is, you only, for example, you want to retile your room, or you want to put your house, you want to just know how many stone blocks do I need for my small house. So what you will go, once you log into the tool, you will just enter the dimension, like I want to build a 20 by 20 feet house, and you select I'll be using bricks, and then you click calculate. We have done all the mathematics and that high engineering behind the platform. So once you just click, it will tell you need 100 blocks of cement. So those tools, we have built them to be open source. So you are not paying any fee. You just log in, you enter your details, and you're able to calculate. If you want to support a community project and you're looking at how you can crowdfund, you go in there, you'll get also the guidance in the level platform where you can be able to enter. You need technical guidance in questions. I think you can reach out to us, but you can also reach out now to the technical professionals within your area who can provide further guidance. So I wouldn't say there's a very specific way. I think the beginning point is to appreciate that you have the power to shape and utilize that. Thank you. In terms of the links to those applications, I believe Cecilia would be sharing the slides, or I can post them on the chat so you can just be able to log in. And if you have queries, feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah, if you could also post them on the chat. It looks like there's an eagerness to get to your tool. So if you could also post them in the Q&A, and then that way it goes out, I think, with the meeting record. You have a question from Russo? Can you hear him?
Sorry, I can't hear him.
He's on mute, I think. Russo, you're on mute.
We can't, if we switch on both microphones, we get a very bad echo. So let me move, hold on.
Appreciating that really the development finance paradox, other than that finance flows from the north to the south, is that again also there is a glut of finance, including climate finance in the north, but the problem really in the south is a dearth of bankable proposals. So from your experience in Madagascar, what are the opportunities and perhaps the pathways that have been identified that can go into build the community's capacity to present bankable proposals? So also appreciating that yes, technology will come to kind of fill in the gap eventually, but that one again is something that will take a bit of time to roll out. So at present, what are the opportunities? And also perhaps you can talk about the approach to funding those communities, especially when it comes to blended finance.
Okay, yeah, sure. Happy to do so. So thanks very much for the question. Worth keeping in mind is that Madagascar is it's a very underdeveloped, right? It's actually, I think, one of the most underdeveloped countries in the world. So a lot of the challenges are a lot of the beneficiaries live sort of in extreme poverty or extreme poverty, right? Which might not be as applicable to Kenya. I mean, there might be some communities, but it's very much a niche that Teteranu found, which was not being addressed by sort of large relief organizations in the country, right? So we found our niche in being a small to medium-sized social enterprise that was addressing a particular need, an area of Madagascar that we found was not being addressed at all. So there was a gap there already, right? So I think it's identifying the gaps and sort of identifying what the local government priorities were in each of the regions, right? And there's the three major regions that we operate in the southeast of Madagascar, right? And it was actually the Department of Education which helped drive quite a lot of the rainwater harvesting systems that were implemented on schools in all the major towns in that area, right? And they were happy to have that because they realized the benefits around that. And the knock-on benefits for the communities. And through those centers, we were then able to upskill the community, right? So I think applying it in sort of like a Kenyan context with opportunities, it's about identifying what are the public structures or the public buildings that can be used as the nodes or the centers of community engagement, right, for a particular purpose, right? So yeah, and then it expanded to hospitals, schools, etc. Right, as soon as everyone realized that what the Department of Education got was what they wanted, right? And then you worry about sort of the residential system sort of as a secondary part, right? But really it was about getting as much of the community engaged as possible. So that's kind of how the need arose and how it kind of unfolded. So the opportunities, yeah, as I said, were definitely driven by engagement with the local government, where there's symposium similar to like what we're having now on the challenges and in Southeast Madagascar on rainwater quality, etc., and what the solutions would be. That was sort of to drum up sort of the interest on that, and then yeah, and then it's been sort of just executing the plan really. From a funding perspective, it was about the organizational design, right? So like, as I said, the organization was designed as a social enterprise to have both corporate and purely profit-driven motives, and at the same time have a not-for-profit arm, right? So it was able to then benefit from like donors who were just only prepared to fund to NGOs, right? So in that way, it was kind of, and then also able to get funding from sometimes the public sector in Madagascar. So using those vehicles, we were able to tap into sort of what you call sort of a hybrid blended finance model almost, to fund the different aspects of the organization, right? And from an organizational structuring perspective, it goes back to like, well, what, as I said, it was new installations, which is pure installation of new projects. Then there was maintenance of existing installations. And then we had the commercial water sales. And then the fourth arm was just like research and development into new initiatives, right? So I'll say like the science aspect, the engineering, new technologies around sort of water, purification, etc. So each one of those pillars has a particular profile of costs, whether they and then matched to the appropriate finance, right? Basically, so you know, higher upfront costs for an installation of a rainwater harvesting system, as opposed to the ongoing maintenance cost, which is more like a regular recurring cost, right? Which then has a different funding profile, right? So splitting those up, matching those to the right and appropriate funders, given the sort of the structure of the organization, kind of was the key.
Okay. Thank you, Cody.
Sure.
Follow-up question on structure. What is the advantage of using the social enterprise model to do everything, sort of have both entities in-house versus creating a partnership or a consortium?
So I think, yeah, so there's not to say that we don't use local partners, right, as well, where we can, but they're more like, I suppose, much smaller partnerships with like the local school or whatever, rather than saying we're entering into consortia. We found, honestly, the politics of a consortia a bit prohibitive, right, in some regards, because there was a secondary board of trustees who all were local NGO trustees, and they just couldn't agree on some of the priorities or whatever. And then we found that things were kind of stalling, right? So, and this was also from my experience at Seed Madagascar, which is the previous organization I was chairman for. They went through great pains to split the organization from the local NGO and just say, well, regardless of the benefits, it's easier for us to just get things done if we operate ourselves. So I think it's about maintaining the relationship, I think, at the lower level to make sure you're still able to effectively deliver the projects, but then also retaining sufficient autonomy to be able to make decisions that are not held back by politics, etc. Right? And so you actually deliver. Yeah.
And in working with the school partners, I know here we have participatory budgeting processes and things like that. And of course, you're saying there's the need to make decisions sometimes rather quickly. To what extent, or how should one frame expectations of the community regarding the amount of control they would have in a participatory budget process?
So yeah, as I said, ultimately with the laws in Madagascar, that the water infrastructure ultimately belongs to the commune, right? So the community knows this, and the same thing, any water infrastructure would belong to the structure it's attached to. For example, say it's the university or the school, or whatever, right? Even if it was built by someone else, right? I suppose the aim of that was that the community would have control of their water, which is a basic need for a human need, right, for survival. So with that in mind, ultimately, I think you're able to reach a point where people realize that it's for their own benefit, right? So they allow some decisions to be made, but ultimately there's got to be a handover back to the community, right? And so there was a lot of engagement with the chef for Kontani, which is basically the chief of the village, basically all of the commune, who it makes a lot of the decisions around those things, right? And then also on top of that, then the local, what was the education, local education, I guess, was a minister who would be engaged on these topics, right? Yeah, we were addressing basic needs at schools and universities, right? Which meant it wasn't such a difficult sell, right? Because like, well, we're going to provide clean water, drinking water at every single one of your schools in a particular region. You wouldn't say no, right? I mean, basically, so from that perspective, I think it's definitely identifying the need. And then after that, then it was the how, speak to the community. And then when we hand it back to you, all of the agents that you saw are actually employees of Taturanu now, because we also found that worked, because they are indirectly employees and they've now got work and they get a stipend, and if they go and monitor the mountain, they get paid for going and looking, etc. Right? And slowly but surely the word spread that this was happening, right? And so their actual employee base has expanded to like more than 100 people, and actually at least 50 of them are just monitoring systems, right? And they're getting what we would consider sort of a relatively small salary, but it's still some more than they would have gotten in the middle of nowhere in the south of Madagascar, right? So it was very much a win-win situation. It hasn't been too challenging to sell this.
And that's switching to Nixon on this issue of participation and compensation. In the opening remarks, there were comments about local wage dynamics being unfair to designers. You as an architect being a designer yourself. And there are different ways of approaching that. There's, of course, direct monetary equivalencies, but there's also not just take the rate of inflation, but take purchasing power and use purchasing power parity. So that what we're saying is, if you're in Nairobi, of course, you'll have less purchasing power than if you were with the same amount of money than if you are in Taita Taveta, for example. You could cover your costs a lot longer, even though you're in the same country. Thinking as architects, where you do a lot of location-based pricing, what do you feel is a good approach to these issues?
Yeah, thanks, Cecilia. That's a very interesting question, which has been on our professional debates for as long as I have been in practice. And I think you have pointed, of course, to some of the options. And I recall our regulator, the Board of Registration of Architects, just gazetted a new fee guideline. And what is funny is that even the current fee, like that professional fee we charge, which is supposed to have factored in, those issues you're talking about, cost, area-based costs, value for the professional service. The reality in practice, it is actually not paid. And what I see more in practice is the marketplace is based on the value for service, the willingness of the customer to pay for that service. Number one, them understanding the value that the architect or the professional they are engaging is bringing on the table, and how much they are also willing to pay. And so I think it has been more of a negotiation base. there is an effort to regulate that, but in practice in Kenya, we negotiate for everything. So at the end of the day, I think as much as we set in principle what could be done by area, by the value inflation, all that, it comes down to individual customer paying for the service, because even the government itself, the truth is, does not pay the fee that they have in the regulation that should be paid. So individuals, corporates also don't pay that. It is more boils into the value. And the challenge more, especially even in the digital age, is for not only architects, I guess, but all professional service providers to really articulate the value of their service and understand the needs of their users. And also be creative to look at how do you provide your service. Like some of our customers think an architect's role is to draw and provide me the drawing. So how do they get to understand that actually the role of the architect is not to draw, is actually to provide professional advice on how to shape the building and deliver a workable living space. And if we are able to articulate that clearly and also understand the need of the client and come up with different revenue models, not only looking at providing that drawing blueprint and taking it to the physical approval authority, I think we can meet in the middle way. But it's a conversation that probably Cody may be able to help me understand how they've been able to break that issue in the financial sector. I would be willing to laugh.
Yeah. I mean, it's not always the interpretation of the financial sector that's the problem, right? I promise you, it's not. It's other people are also to blame for some of the miss. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, just in my professional life in London, right? For example, architects are often just seen as them as produce the drawing, right? But actually, you actually had to engage with them, otherwise it was never going to go ahead, right? Because they need to provide constant input into how things are being done, and otherwise it doesn't work. I mean, some housing schemes that I saw in London had like clearly a balcony in the wrong place, right? I'm like, well, how did that happen? Like, where was the architect? Like, well, he wasn't asked for his opinion. I'm like, well, then that's how that happened, right? I mean, yeah.
And to both of you, what about the use of design templates? Because a lot of people say, well, if I have a basic, I don't know how to organize. For example, in the US, there's now this thing of tiny homes. And a tiny home, for those who don't know, instead of thinking of 3,000 square feet of living space, you reduce yourself to about 40 feet, some as small as 20 feet of living space. But you put everything in there. You put your kitchen, you put your water closet, you put everything. And of course, it takes a lot more design to be able to fit everything in a tiny space. So in Los Angeles, state of California, they've now created basic templates that are open source. Even with that, there's a lot of architects selling templates because everybody wants their customized design. Both your opinions on that approach.
So from my perspective, I think it works well from a standardization perspective as to what like the minimum requirements are, especially in the context of like affordable housing, right? What constitutes something which is livable for like a 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom house, right? And what this minimum health and safety standards need to be for those, right? I think from that perspective it works, but then after that it stops working because there's often quite unique problems to sites, etc., right, around and there are lots of restrictions and for whatever reason, right, particularly I think in places that are highly regulated like the UK, right? And so then stuff needs to start changing, right? So you definitely need experienced architects there to then adapt what the minimum requirement is into something that's livable in the context of where we are and what we're trying to do, right, basically. Yeah.
I absolutely agree with Cody. I would just also add probably another perspective that, yeah, we're okay to live in a standardized hotel room, right? But who wants to live in a hotel the rest of his life or her life? They eventually, at some point, we want to feel identity, some identity, unique manifestation the space that I own. If you are giving it for me, I am limited in my options. I will go with the standard. So I think where we need to really manifest our unique needs in the area for that market by personal identity, we want to shape that space. And so as Cody puts there, requires how do we customize those basic minimum required standardized modules that we have for the units to something that I own and speaks to me. And so I think there are those two sides of the coin.
Thank you. And as you, before you switch off, closing remarks on transition strategy and the way forward?
So from my perspective, I think it's, again, by back to what, articulating the vision, right? What is the strategy going to look like in 5, 10, 20 X years, right? Whatever you think is appropriate, but then breaking it down to like a process level so that like non-scientific people, non-engineering people, non-architectural people, especially the finance people and the ones that are going to put the money behind it, so to say, can understand what the commitments are going to be and how long they should be waiting for returns, etc. Right? It's just about communicating, I think, at that level, so that everyone understands what's going on, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think Cody broke it down very well. Starts with defining where we are and setting the vision. Where do we want to go? And also, what do we need in between to get us there? And I think they are practical. Number one, of course, he's spoken the finance, speaking in their language. There may be need for, rules and principles we need to apply along the way and policies. So those may need to be shaped, those policies, and they need to be costed. Then we need to look at who do we also need to work with along that journey. So there would be, it's not only how much we need, but also who do we need going together with. That requires capacity. That would also require data, so strengthening the knowledge and awareness. And whether you're talking of where we are, you need the baseline, that is data. Where we want to go, it is also data. Who do we go with? There's people and partnerships. So, and then it has to be funded. Those people are not going to work without, the financial resources tied to them as well. So I think, to me, this transition strategy will have to factor in those three. Thank you.
And then before I bring in Russo, I'll just say on our part, we commit to simplifying the 6 hours we've presented over the past 3 days, because a lot of comments have been, it's a lot of information to absorb all at once. And if we could break it down into actionable steps. So we commit as that. And with that, I'll let Russo from our board give the final closing remark.
So on the way forward, I'd already mentioned that communities really
Can't really hear you, Russo. I don't know if it's just me.
I'm audible now?
Yeah, that's better now, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So as I'd already mentioned, that communities need to be more proactive in telling the private sector the outcomes that are desired. And I guess part of what the capacity building to the communities and also again to the private sector is really being able to translate now the indigenous knowledge into finance speak, so that in the interim, everything is understood before now we really have the opportunity for large-scale technology rollout so that now the data is absolute. So finally, I'll just jump in on behalf of the board and Professor Wandiga to thank all the panelists and the attendees for joining this session. And we really look forward to more engagement once Cecilia has shared the required slides. We will be looking at further engagement to kind of push through, or rather get the actionable points that we need to move through as partnerships, as consortiums, to kind of address what we are looking at achieving. With that, I will say thank you. And perhaps, Cecilia, you can do the final remarks.
Thank you, everyone. And so for those who have been asking and thinking that CSTI is a Cecilia show, it's not. You've now had 6 days of seeing who else I talked to, and sometimes also different parts of the world to which we talk to. So another inside joke is Cecilia never sleeps. She's always on WhatsApp trying to answer. So it is time management, but it's also trying to connect with everybody. And we'll start working on those issues and expect more rollout from us. And we thank those who encouraged us to put a face to the different people, to the team, and to tell the story that we've known internally, and stop assuming that others know it. So this has been an excellent opportunity to present it to others. Thank you so much. And we'll see you for the next climate summit, but in between, you will you'll walk the journey with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.